Thank you, Mr. Sriram, and thank you, Mr. Praveen and friends at CPDRS for this important discussion on a topic that is relevant. And thank you all for patiently listening to my introduction. I should have probably provided a shorter introduction. And it would have helped if I had the question paper from Mr. Sriram little earlier. But I will certainly try and address some of the questions that he has raised. Since I have a flight tonight, I won't speak for too long, maybe 25 to 30 minutes, and then make way for Mr. Ravi and others to take over. Now, my responses to the Iran war are at two or three levels, which may not meet the ordinary and obvious expectation on the topic. For example, the economic impact of the war on India is probably the most obvious and direct topic. But I'm not going to dwell on that too much because, firstly, I'm not an expert on economics. And secondly, I'm of the view that there are other perspectives also which may not be so obvious to us relating to the war and its impact on India, which require some discussion. The first broad point that I want to make is that we should examine not only the impact of the war on India, but simultaneously examine India's role in the war to see where we stand in the larger scheme of things. And this, in my opinion, can only be done comparatively. It will not be sufficient for us to say that we were neutral. I don't believe we were entirely neutral in the war. But we need to look at the role of two of our neighbors in this war and see the impact or outcome of the war on them. And then take a look at our role and the effects of the war in India. The first is obviously Pakistan. Now, many people have been surprised with Pakistan's prominent role as the mediator, not only the venue for mediation, but also in many ways the facilitator of the mediation that brought about this uneasy peace or stalemate that is in force today. How long it will last is still a question. But the fact that Pakistan has been able to play that role itself, I think, is striking. I wonder why India was not able to play that role, being a giant in the Indian subcontinent. And considering our relations with all countries involved, and by that I don't mean our current international relations, but I mean our historical and civilizational relations with all concerned, I thought India was well placed to have been an influencer in the outcomes and the peace that could have been achieved in this war, but we played no such role. We have indirectly played a role in Pakistan's promotion to this position. And for that, we have to actually look back at Operation Sindoor, which is exactly a year ago. And I'm not making any comment on the operation itself, except to say, and this is the subject of my book, which was last published, Poles Apart, which is that in Pakistan, the relationship between the military and politics is far more overt and direct than it is in India. And in Pakistan's history, predominantly the military has called the shots directly, and even otherwise it has done so indirectly. It's never ever out of the picture. But what Sindoor did for Pakistan is that it brought the army back into preeminence in Pakistani society and in the minds of the Pakistani people, which frankly was not the case till Sindoor, because the army was not holding that status that it did hitherto. Even with the ouster of Imran Khan, the army was still, in a way, doing a bit of backseat driving. And from what I understand, the people of Pakistan, especially the youth of Pakistan, did not necessarily hold the army in that esteem, and nor did the powers in the world. But we know that a direct outcome of Operation Sindoor was that the army came back into the mainstay, into the frame in Pakistan. More so, General Asim Munir became a field marshal, only the second field marshal after Field Marshal Ayub Khan, some would say self appointed. They also brought about constitutional amendments to introduce a chief of defense staff and other serious amendments, not only to the military apparatus, but also to weaken the Supreme Court. I don't have time to go into that. And for all practical purposes, since then till now, the face of Pakistan actually has not so much been their prime minister, but the field marshal. And when I say the face, I don't just mean the face in the media, but I mean the face that speaks to foreign powers and negotiates and so on. And you will recall, friends, that Operation Sindoor was in fact announced abruptly to an end by President Trump. And he, in fact, didn't give India the importance that we may have deserved. But we took it on the chin, and I'm happy that peace was the outcome. But what also happened there is that the US and Pakistan came much closer to each other than I think they had been before that. And one of the direct results of that, I think, is to be seen now in the mediation process that took place and the implicit trust that the US has in Pakistan. I know people make comments that Pakistan is acting as a mouthpiece of the US, etc. That might have its own truth. But nonetheless, take it from me, the US must have a high degree of trust in the country, in the leadership, in the military establishment, to be able to go through with this negotiation or mediation, and in fact do it on Pakistani soil. There would have been many other alternatives, but yet Pakistan was chosen. Now, this role of a mediator is actually a very important role of peacekeeping in a larger global perspective. And I wish that India could have played it, but we did not. And now please compare also the role of our other neighbor, which is China. China has had a direct role in this war in its own way. It's done some tough speaking when it had to. It has in fact supported Iran. It's not been neutral. China has supported Iran not just morally or orally, it has supported Iran with weapons and technology, which is one of the reasons that Iran was able to withstand this onslaught. Taking on the US and taking on Israel is no mean task. And that too for a smaller country like Iran with not many friends. We all know very well about the divide in the world between the Shia and Sunni world, and one saw that. The entire UAE and several other Muslim states did not support Iran. In fact, they got drawn in on opposing sides because many of those were being used as bases for the US. But here again, China was able to play a fairly, may I say, active role. And a lot of these things we don't know, right? Because a lot of this happens behind the scenes. But I can say with almost certainty that China's position in the war is something the US and Israel most certainly have factored in while considering the option of going in for peace and not any of the other stated reasons for the war. And here again, India, I think, had the luxury in many ways, economically, in terms of military might, in terms of size, and as I said, the civilizational relationships that we enjoyed with Iran, with the US more recently, but we were not able to match up to either of these options and chose to play this rather ambiguous role in the war, which has left at least us of not the international standing that I feel we could have enjoyed. You see, questions also arise here as to our state of present international relations and our foreign affairs. And we have to dwell on that because building of international relations over not just years but decades is done with a view, in my limited understanding, to be put to good use in a time of crisis. It's not all trade and economics, it's geopolitical considerations. And in cases like this, it's in fact global considerations that come into play. And had we been able to develop them clearly and leverage them, we would have certainly been able to play a much bigger role. But instead, our impact has been not positive in that sense. We practically left Iran in the lurch, other than a few token words that we used in support. We did not necessarily leverage our rapport with the US either. We've had historical relationships with Russia, which is important in a way because of the whole oil crisis that India could have faced because of the blockade at the Strait of Hormuz. We rely heavily on that strait for our oil supplies. But I'm afraid to say our positioning and our leverage with each of these has not necessarily made a big difference either to us or to the outcome of the war. And should the war, God forbid, once again resume, I don't know how India will be able to change the paradigm or be the better for it. And here, when we examine the role of India and the war in the international context, we must also examine the impact of the war on Indian diaspora. Sitting here in India, we may not even be directly affected by the war. Of course, many socio-economic strata in India are affected when it comes even to everyday gas supplies, oil supplies, etc. That's a fact. But otherwise, for the media, which is baying for blood, often is war hungry. We saw that during Sindoor. The real impact is not necessarily felt on those who are crying out for war. It is felt by others, people in border states, people serving in the forces, and as I said, the diaspora. Now, the Indian diaspora in the context of the Iran war can be looked at from two angles. I think one is the diaspora in the US itself, which is a large and a powerful diaspora. And they seem to be able to go with anything that the Indian government says, and they go with anything, it seems, that the American president says. And you heard the kind of loose comments that the president of the United States had to make about India, and I would dare say indirectly about Indians. To quote him, he even called India a hellhole in one tweet. Now, you can brush it aside and say that Donald Trump just shoots from the hip and he has used far worse language when it comes to Iran and so on. But the fact is, we've swallowed this. Other than a token protest, there's very little we've said. And it makes me wonder what the estimation of Indians in America is after this. What is their standing and credibility? That is also a collateral outcome of the war. And then comes the more vulnerable, at least this diaspora, from my understanding, by and large, is economically well placed. But then you have the diaspora in the UAE, in the Gulf regions, maybe even in Iran, but definitely in the Gulf regions, the large diaspora of working class Indians who are there stranded in the war. We have to look at the impact of the war there. And yes, the Indian government did its bit to try and evacuate people from there. It took its own sweet time. I know friends and people who have been stranded there and the efforts they had to make to get out, the huge risks they faced. But again, these were people with the privilege of being able to extricate themselves and fly back to India, whether it was via Kochi or Bombay, in some cases via Muscat. Some have flown to Europe, those can afford it. That's a bit different matter. There is a certain strata of working class Indians who do not have that privilege and they continue to live and work in the UAE. Many of them have been at the receiving end, they've been injured, some have died as a result of the war. And I think we have to look at the impact of the war on those groups as well. India is not just all of us sitting in India. India is, I think, an extended concept of all Indians across the world. And I think this becomes an important question as well. And look, friends, when I return to the position that we had, a friend of mine, Colonel Tushar, who retired from the army recently, he told me that in many of their instruction classes, in the armed forces, they are told for you to really understand India's security issues, you should invert the Indian map. I'm not saying this with any disrespect. I know the map is also one of our national emblems. But I'm saying from a strategic point of view, if you look at the Indian map inverted, you then realize how much of it would actually be covered by the sea if you were looking at the south now on the north. We tend to look north. But should you look at an inverted map, you would realize you're surrounded by the high seas, the Indian Ocean, and beyond on most sides. And even our strategic positioning in the waters and the role of the Navy becomes paramount. For the longest time, the Indian Navy was not even regarded as a main fighting force. It was really, I think, in the 71 war with the liberation of Bangladesh that the Navy was the first time actually used holistically in a conflict scenario. And over the years, again, and some of the utterances that were made by one of the earlier chiefs of defense staff showed that even the Air Force, for that matter, not just the Navy, were not treated with the same importance as the Indian Army. But look at what happened in the Indian Ocean. I'll grant it didn't happen in our own waters, but just beyond, around Sri Lanka, the sinking of the Iranian submarine. And we had nothing to do other than express our regret, which, as you know, means nothing. These were naval officers who were on our shores. They were in Kerala for joint operations. And they suddenly found themselves like sitting ducks in the high seas. And when we speak of our role as a Vishwaguru, etc., then it's quite necessary, in my opinion, that in this situation, we should have had a voice to prevent it if we could, or to respond to it. And we didn't. And this is where I think Iran will see us as having betrayed them. I've used this word before, but we do have civilizational relations with Iran. And I believe that we may have forgotten about those. But the US and Israel have gone a step ahead and actually completely discounted what Iranian civilizational identity is. If you are to understand Iran as a nation and a fighting force, you actually have to go back to the Battle of Karbala. The betrayal of Imam Hussein, the sacrifice, what we look at Muharram as an annual, religious function actually has far deeper connotations to the Shia and particularly the Irani people. And for them, this war was a matter of survival. And as much as there was internal strife, their own civil society felt that there was a need for change, etc. I don't think any of them bought into the fact that Israel was there to ensure this change. In fact, that is the bluff of the war. The fact that the US and Israel have spoken in completely different voices, and between the two of them, who are supposed to be allied behind this war, I have heard at least 3, if not 4 objectives behind the war. And those objectives have changed. And to be frank, those objectives cannot even be harmonized. Regime change was one. What regime change? This was not a CIA operation where you could internally bring about a change as America has done historically. This was not Venezuela. You couldn't go pick up the president overnight and bring them across. The assassination of the Khamenei, in fact, rejuvenated the Iranian people. And what the US completely miscalculated is that the Iran was ready for this war because it was vulnerable. And it had 4 or 5 layers of command. And nobody was dispensable. And if you see, many of their leaders who died in the course of the war were people who were walking the streets fearlessly 1 or 2 days before they died. That is a different DNA. And this was not factored in. And the regime change that the US had in mind was very different from the so-called regime change that Israel spoke about. Israel's idea of regime change in Iran was far more extreme. It would have almost been an elimination of Iran, like the Hezbollah, that the Israel wants completely out, which is why Lebanon has been at the receiving end and has suffered severe damages during the course of the war. Then came this whole nuclear bogey, like Iraq, weapons of mass destruction which were never found. On the one hand, you said you want to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. Then Hegseth says at another congressional meeting, we intended to prevent Iran from even gaining nuclear weapons. Which of the two is it? How many bluffs can there be? And where are those nuclear warheads that you speak about? Or is it your imagination? And even this nuclear threat that was built up, as was said earlier, the proliferation of nuclear arms has gone on merrily in other parts of the world. And the only country, which I think the Italian Prime Minister and the Greek Prime Minister perhaps said, the only country to have actually used nuclear weapons against others has been America. So what if you turn this on its head? So friends, the point I'm making here is, in all of these serious issues, India should have had a say. And this actually relates to a point that I want to emphasize, which is really the breakdown of the international law, the order of international law over the last, well, it's been happening for a long time, but I think it was at its sharpest here. We saw that in Gaza, and the inability of international law to address it and international institutions to address it, other than lip service. And in the war, I think this particular Iran war will be remembered for the practical collapse of the UN Security Council and the inability to do anything of worth, which is a huge alarm, I think, for the world at large. Right? Professor Holland had said that that international law is the vanishing point of jurisprudence. I don't know if he foresaw that it would be so real and so drastic in such short a time. Treaty of Versailles, 2 world wars, you would have thought we would have been the better for it. And India should have had a role at that high table. We are not permanent members of the Security Council. We are not in a position to influence those outcomes. But then we have to play the regional role, as I said. If a country is powerful and cannot, in the same breath, influence international institutions, then it should be able to regionally, as an independent country, have some influence. Impact is one thing. Impact should be from India also, not just on India. And that was not there. And it makes you wonder where things stand. And in fact, if one looks at direct outcomes of this war, it's going to be direct and greater militarization. Right? Germany, I was reading recently, who has had because of the effects of World War II and maybe the guilt and the shame associated with the Holocaust, for a long time, Germany has not been overtly military as it might have liked to be. But now Germany makes no bones. It's just an example. It has a far more aggressive military doctrine. And I'm still, frankly, reading about it. It's a new development. But that's not the only example. The world at large is militarizing. And the military-industrial axis and the role that it plays in wars, how wars affect oil prices, how oil prices affect stock markets, are real issues. Those are, in some ways, if not the ulterior motives, they're certainly the ulterior outcomes of war. And there are investigations on in the US as we speak about those who have made millions and millions of dollars hedging their risks on when the war will begin, when the war will end. And these are bets, for the want of a better word, being placed on the lives of tens of thousands of innocent people. And India, I think, should be conscious there also. This is a moral issue for a country. Are we in any way driving the moral conversation forward? Are we addressing the gaps in the international regime? Or are we jumping onto the bandwagon and getting more militaristic? We have to be, friends, engaged with this conversation. It's going to be important because militarization comes with its own ill effects. It comes with its own economic effects, but it also comes with its own national security issues, right? And the more you arm yourself, the more one is tempted to use those arms. And you have to remember, friends, that in this war that the US and Israel have started, and in my view, it's an unjust war. The UN, the Security Council had every right to declare it as an unjust war. It was neither a war that was commenced with the approval or sanction of the UN, nor was it a war in self-defense, which in my view are the two circumstances in which a war could be treated as just in an international law sense. Neither of those factors were available. But this war also reached a stage where people realistically believed that there could actually be a nuclear attack. And one of the posts that President Trump put out 1 or 2 days before the peace negotiations began was actually a direct threat of annihilation. So you see how the objectives have shifted: regime change, nuclear disarmament, democracy in Iran, Western liberal democracy. And suddenly you're talking about bombing them to the Stone Ages. Those were the words. Now, this also becomes a very important issue, not just for America, but for the rest of the world. Trust me, this issue should be addressed head on. Because firstly, the impact of a nuclear war is global. Should the US go that far, China and Russia are not going to sit back and take it on the chin. Maybe that was the deterrent. And as I said, these were countries that were able to have a countervailing force. India should have had that also. The other question is on the whole protocols involved in nuclear wars. And what is the universal principle when it comes to going nuclear? I'm afraid there is none. And you'll have to think about that, friends. I would hope that India becomes the guiding light, if not on nuclear disarmament, then at least, of course, we have the no first use doctrine, but also, and I'm maybe thinking here as a lawyer, as to the actual protocols and procedures that go into the declaration of a nuclear attack. And trust me, this is an important point. In the US, it is so lopsided that that power is literally a power of veto vesting in the president. And should the president say we want to attack Iran or, God forbid, some other country tomorrow with a nuclear weapon, strictly speaking, it has to be done. There are checks and balances only by way of custom. When you've had bold officers historically who have issued memos saying, please also ask the Secretary of State, please also ask the Defense Secretary, now known as the War Secretary, but that is not written into their law. And that's a huge void, in my opinion. And every country has its own nuclear protocol and nuclear doctrine. We have what we call the Nuclear Command Authority. Thankfully, we don't have a lopsided setup like that. And this authority, a lot of it is hush-hush. It's not publicly known. But by and large, for a start, you at least have an authority. It's not the call of one person. And that authority would have, apart from the Prime Minister, the Ministers of Defense, probably the Minister of Home, National Security Advisors, and I suppose the Chiefs of Staff or the Chief of Defense Staff at least. And whether or not others are officially there, one must defer to the Foreign Ministry and others. But here again, it's very important that people in power have the spine and the voice to say and do the right thing. We know of hundreds of committees who ultimately toe the line. And this is going to be very important for India in a civil-military relations perspective. It's taking me back to my first point as I conclude, which is that in Pakistan, the civil-military relations, as I explained to you, work in a different direction. And in India, the civil-military relations have historically prided themselves in the fact that the military, and especially the army, have been apolitical and neutral. And when it was important, have made their presence felt. They have, by and large, kept out of politics. But when it has come to crucial decisions of national security, going to war like in 1971, etc., they have not just simply obeyed directions from the executive, but they have had an autonomous and independent view on the matter. I think it's going to be very important, and this is going to also be an impact of the war in India. As I said, maybe not the obvious ones, but certainly collateral ones, which is to see how much of independence and moral courage the top brass of the Indian military can have in trying circumstances. I would like to watch that because things have been changing. I saw recently there were awards being distributed by Sadhguru to serving military officers. Now, there's no harm in respecting and recognizing the services and the bravery of the Indian officers and troops. But what I found striking, and a lot of veterans also have commented on it, is that many of these serving officers and senior officers at that attended these functions in uniform. They received these, I don't know what to call them. They are not PVSMs or Veer Chakras or recognized military decorations. They received the Sadhguru medal, for the want of a better phrase, in uniform, in the presence of the Minister for Defense, genuflecting to a religious leader. It's fine. Respect is one thing. But here, now you find military, civil, religious combined. And I think that is something, if it is kept with lines clearly drawn, great. But if it starts overlapping more and more each day, then there are no lines left anymore. Then you will have military playing politics, you'll have politics playing religion, etc., etc. We speak of separation of powers in the Indian constitution of the judiciary, executive, and the legislature. I think this is also an important separation of powers or of positions. And I think, friends, that will also be, I think, something that we need to watch very consciously. And in my opinion, these are some of the aspects that arise in the light of the Iran war, their impact on India, India's countervailing impact on other outcomes in the larger geopolitics of the times that we live in. So I will stop with that, and thank you for having me.